Silicon Flatirons is a research center at Colorado Law School. We work with students to give them the tools they need to pursue careers in tech, law, policy, and entrepreneurship.
When I started, Silicon Flatirons was an experiment. It was me and some students putting on a few conferences without really a plan where it was going to go. My initial motivation was because I didn't believe you could have impactful policy discussions unless you brought people together across different disciplines. Silicon Flatirons Center has given me an image of what a team can look like.
And it really made Boulder into a location that was seen as on par with DC or Silicon Valley and other places around the country that are leading thought centers in the field of law and tech.
What's excited me the most is to see it grow, but not only just grow in terms of the number of people attending our different events, but growing in terms of the different areas that we have been involved in.
When a law student says, I've got a passion for understanding the intersection of technology and law, but where do I get started with that? What Flatirons provides is a position to actually go angle for a job during their second summer, where they're actually going to get to be involved directly in setting tech policy or in advocating around tech policy.
The Silicon Flatirons community is incredibly unique in how close it is and how people are willing to band together to move conversations forward.
It's one thing to be sitting in a room by yourself reading articles, and it's very much another thing to actually be sitting at a table talking to somebody about their daily experiences of trying to navigate compliance with a complex new law.
We're all a community of friends who enjoy spending time with one another.
The people we engage with through here are very much thinkers and thought leaders, so they're contributing to whether it's our strategy or our resources in really meaningful ways.
Silicon Flatirons has changed the dynamic between Colorado law and the surrounding community as well as the national community.
One of the great joys of my profession is talking to people who are really early in their careers and helping them get excited about what you're excited about.
We get the types of people in the room that everyone thinks should be talking to one another, but often are not.
I get to work with students, I get to work with attorneys, I get to work with policymakers at the intersection of all these issues.
Students are first and foremost, so everything is generally student-driven.
And it is centered around people who are wanting to engage with students.
I've seen students come into Silicon Flatirons just having a little interest in it, in year one, and by year three, they're passionate about it and they found their career.
And I think that that really helps the standing of the university more broadly, and it also attracts lots of really interesting and talented speakers.
I think what I'm excited to see happen with Silicon Flatirons in the next 5, 10, even 20 years is for it to blend continuity with change.
It's not enough to have smaller conversations anymore. The world is all connected, and Silicon Flatirons is going to reflect that global nature of the internet as we move forward into 20 years in the future.
I hope it continues to operate with the same spirit of experimentation, of adventure, of seeking out new challenges that we've done over the first 20 years.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. My name is Vanessa. I'm the events manager for Silicon Flatirons. Thank you for joining us online tonight. I hope everyone had a wonderful weekend, and I just have a couple quick housekeeping notes. In case you're unfamiliar with the Zoom webinar format, I'm jealous of you, but just know that we cannot see or hear you unless you're a panelist. So don't worry about that. We do have the QA function enabled, so we welcome your questions during the conversation, and you can also upvote if there's a particular question that appeals to you that's already been asked. And then I'd also like to plug our AirMeet reception, which we will hold after the conversation tonight. It's a really easy format to use, browser based, so just making sure that you're connecting from Chrome works the best. But we've had really great conversations happening there and people actually meeting each other, and it feels good. So I hope to see you there. And then a last note is that we have captions available tonight. I thank the captioners and hope that anyone who needs that is able to access it. Without further ado, I will hand things over to Nathan. go ahead, Nathan, you can take yourself off mute.
Nathan, are you able to?
Yes, I'm sorry. A Zoom crash at the worst possible moment.
Take it away, Nathan.
All right. Well, I'm so glad to be back. And after a little bit of a glitch there, I'm Nathan Schneider. I'm a assistant professor of media studies in the College of Media Communication and Information at CMCI. And I'm so glad to be part of this event and to help launch it. I've been such a grateful participant and audience member in many Silicon Flatirons events, so it's a real pleasure and privilege to play this role here. Now, the work that I do around startups and in the internet economy has shown me over and over that how we innovate depends on how capital flows, and that's especially the case in the context of a crisis like we're in today. And over and over, I've seen examples of founders who are pursuing worthy strategies, who have worthy ambitions, yet somehow the capital isn't flowing there. And the opportunities for them to try out their idea don't become manifest in ways that they might. And this affects all of us. The things that we get to benefit from as users, as consumers, as potential employees, all also depend on where the capital flows, where investment happens. And it forces us to ask, what opportunities are the investors and maybe the rest of us seeing and not seeing? What are we blind to? And that's I think going to be part of what we're talking about tonight as we explore a new fund and a member of our community who is asking some of these questions for herself. This is also an intrinsically interdisciplinary issue. I'm reminded of a phrase that Professor Bernthal here uses a lot: collapse the campus. And that's something that we're doing here. These are issues that relate to law, and that's a reason that we're doing this through the law school. But at the same time, these are issues that matter to those of us over in media studies and journalism and anybody who has a stake in the future of the online economy. So I'm really excited to introduce a member of the CMCI Advisory Board, our featured speaker tonight, Kelly Graziadei. She's a founder and general partner of F7 Ventures. She graduated from CU Boulder on a full ride scholarship in the School of Journalism, which is now folded into CMCI. And she graduated with honors as well. In 2010, she joined Facebook and ultimately led the monetization product marketing arm for the direct response ads and commerce global business. And then in 2018, became a founding partner of F7, an early stage venture fund composed initially of 7 female ex-Facebookers focused in their investments on diverse funders and founders. So really challenging, trying to take head on the pattern that we've seen for many years now, where the venture investment environment has tended to be very homogenous, both in terms of the investors and the founders who receive investment. And in 2016, Kelly delivered the commencement address for the University of Colorado Boulder. So she's been back here a number of times. So it's really a pleasure to have her here again, at least virtually from the Bay Area where she lives, I believe. Interviewing her, leading this conversation will be Brad Bernthal, Associate Professor of Law at CU Boulder, who's founder of the Silicon Flatiron Center's Entrepreneurship Initiative. So most of you, many of you are probably very familiar with Brad's work and his leadership in this community. He's been a leader in our Boulder and CU entrepreneurial community in many ways, being a leader in, for instance, the New Venture Challenge and a range of entrepreneurial programs, bringing together over and over the off-campus and on-campus entrepreneurial communities, and bringing a lot of value to both in the process. He's also been kind of beloved and sometimes feared guest in my disruptive entrepreneurship class for his really extraordinary way of teaching through questioning. So he's really an extraordinary person to play this kind of role. And I've also really appreciated his research, his recent article on the evolution of entrepreneurial finance. Really geeky here, but it was an incredibly eye-opening read for me, something that I go back to over and over in my own work. And maybe after today, he'll have to write an addendum. So Brad, take it away.
Well, that is a fabulous introduction. Thanks for the kind words, Nathan. It has been really a delight to partner with you and CMCI to present tonight's event, which you suggest as well. And thank you so much for bringing Kelly back to campus. I think we can all agree that Nathan has the best background for Zoom, full stop, in the universe behind you. I love what you got there. Before we get going, just a couple notes. One is I get to do a lot of the talking at Silicon Flatirons, but this is a team game, and our team, you heard from Vanessa at the outset, Heather, Nate, Sarah, Amy, Catherine. I just want to say thank you to all the people at Silicon Flatirons who I'm privileged to work with that helped present tonight. And in terms of where we are going, Kelly and I are going to do about 50 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll reserve the last 25 to 30 minutes for interaction with the attendees. Thank you all for being here tonight. And then at 7 o'clock, I encourage you to join the Air Meets reception, which really is, I mean, it's not as good as the real thing, but it's pretty close. Like it's actually a chance for some serendipity and for you to meet some people. So that is where we're going tonight. Kelly, I'm going to ask you to take yourself off mute. And, if we were in person, I mean, the thunderous applause right now, the spotlight, the fireworks that we usually have going on, security would be protecting you from the throngs of people. But this is going to be a fun night. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I want to echo, thank you for the very kind intro, Nathan. And also Brad, it sounds like through questions, I actually have my notepad out because it sounds like I'm going to be learning some things through your line of questioning, which I have no doubt. But thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I am a huge Buff fan through and through, so it's really nice to be here.
Well, let's start by talking about where you are today briefly in terms of F7. So I know it's you and 6 colleagues from Facebook. You pooled your capital at the outset, and the investment thesis is getting behind female founders, diverse founders as at least part of the purpose. Talk a little bit about F7 Ventures overall and your day-to-day.
Absolutely. So we came together, really it was this time 2 years ago. We started having the conversation, and what had happened for me, I had left Facebook, I think late 2017. And I went to a venture capital firm and I did what they call an entrepreneur in residence. But it was a fantastic opportunity, particularly coming out of being so heads down in all things Facebook for 8 years. I sat around the table with weekly pitch meetings and diligence and making investment decisions. And with that, I started doing some investing on my own and became acutely aware of a couple things. One was how few female check writers there are. So only 5.5% of venture firms are actually led by women. And out of all venture firms, only 13% of total check writers are female. And that's actually, the good news is that's moving in the right direction. That's up from 9% over the last couple of years, but we still have a long way to go. And as I started writing some checks on my own, I had a moment where I feel like I could do much more and go further with some other ex-Facebook colleagues and women that I know would also be really motivated to start to make a difference in that ecosystem. And so I started reaching out to colleagues, and essentially F7 was born. And so we were motivated to change those numbers. We were also motivated because we all came together and worked together and had what we saw as this kind of once in a lifetime operating experience at Facebook, building and leading multiple functional teams. And we wanted to find a way to take that experience and translate it to just be helpful to early stage founders and ultimately improve their success and outcomes where we could.
So at the final 15 or 20 minutes of today's discussion, we're going to come back to F7. I want to dig into your work as an investor in the fund. But for now, if you'll indulge me, let's go back to, you're from Littleton.
Parker, close, further south. Keep going.
Hopefully I'll get more accurate as we go along here. You're from Parker. You came to CU, as Nathan alluded to, you studied journalism, and I think with an advertising emphasis. Was there anything in your past growing up in Parker or at CU that sort of foretold the adventure and really the growth of the internet, or being part of Facebook and the internet economy? Was there anything in your background like, I could have seen this coming?
That's a good question. I mean, I wish I foretold the birth of the internet. I feel like this would be a wholly different conversation. I do like to share with people that Mark Zuckerberg was in middle school when I was at CU. So that's a good reminder that as much as when you're in college, you're racking your brain trying to decide what you're going to be when you grow up, there are things not even yet invented, and Facebook was one of them. But as I look at my background, I think there's a couple things that stand out. One is I just really loved things that were ambiguous. I loved building things from scratch. I didn't love a lot of boxes and definition. And so, I mean, I think, growing up earlier, that's harder to see. I think you have a lot of boxes and definition in middle school and high school, et cetera. But in college, I mean, that's where I really found myself gravitating towards things where I could have a lot of flexibility. And so one example of that is I was part of something at CU called President's Leadership Class, which some people may be familiar with. And there were a number of things that were phenomenal about that. One, on my third year, I was able to be a teaching assistant. And at that time, the teaching assistant in PLC, I had a lot of flexibility to essentially once a week design that class with a small group of students and figure out what we talked about and what the assignments were and how we measured it. And I think there are things I'm sure I did well and things I didn't do well, and trying to navigate all of that. But I think that's an example of where I would seek something like that out. Another PLC example, my fourth year, we'd actually received a grant from the Ford Foundation and needed to design a residential academic program rooted in experiential learning. And so we'd received this grant. It was wide open greenfield space. It was myself and a partner, and we needed to go out and do research and ultimately make a recommendation of what this should look like. And that's pretty daunting when you're kind of sitting at the bottom of the mountain and looking up, but also really fun. And I love the freedom and flexibility that comes with things like that.
So in both of these examples, I'm hearing you highlight instances in which you were tackling projects that were sort of amorphous or at least very broad and open-ended. And I'm assuming that as you got to Silicon Valley, whether it was at Facebook or before that, and we'll talk about some of those experiences, you found other open-ended projects that you were going to tackle. Did that turn out to be fairly transferable for you?
It really did. And that's, I think it's an important note too. Well, first of all, I thought about in college, I don't know if I knew what an entrepreneur was. And part of me feels like if I knew that, I would have definitely been like, I want to do that. But I don't know that was as clear. And even today, I think sometimes we can have a very specific definition or picture of what we think an entrepreneur looks like. But I think, long before like starting my own business, there were themes of that throughout. And so the examples I share in college, but beyond that. So I moved to San Francisco after school. Funny enough, my first job was at the phone company, which we could probably spend a whole hour on, from stories, etc. But I was there essentially when then the internet is blowing up, and I'm looking around, and I immediately was like, I want to do that. I don't even think I know what it is, but I want to go do that. And so that theme played throughout. So I went and joined a company called Alta Vista, which got gobbled up ultimately by Google. I was in the realm of search. I just picked the wrong company. But that was a theme of, no one really knew what they were doing, and we're trying to figure it out. Similarly, I then joined Yahoo, and the reason I joined that was because they were starting a whole brand new team, and I could come in and start it and build it and figure out what the thing was going to do. And then fast forward from there, I ultimately got the call to join Facebook. And one of the stories I like to share there is the timing of that was actually not great for me personally. I had just had my first child. He was 3 months old. I lived an hour and a half from Facebook headquarters, and there was no remote work when I joined in 2010. And so it was a decision I really grappled with, because it was going to be, I was 3+ hours in the car every day, going to and from with an infant at home. But ultimately, I couldn't resist this opportunity that was so greenfield. It was growing like crazy. And I knew I didn't want to sit there and say I could have had a chance to have a seat on that, if you want to call it a bus or a rocket ship or whatever you want to call it, but that I could have had a seat. And I'm like, I don't think I can live with myself if I turn it down. And so that thematically for me was just stuff I chased throughout my career.
I want to go back to some of the experiences that you had at CU that may, in retrospect, have prepared you for these, I think you used the word greenfield jobs, whether it's Alta Vista in the early days of search, or joining Yahoo at an early point, or Facebook as mobile is just starting to become a thing in 2010. And I'm going to put it in the context of a family dispute that we just had last week. I've got a high school senior, and my wife said, no way you're studying philosophy in college. You've got to come out with a job. Notably and predictably, I studied philosophy in college, right? And I think that
might be something behind that argument, but we can.
There's a lot behind that argument. But I think a lot of our current students and their parents are feeling this pressure to do something in terms of focus in higher education that is very practical, that's going to directly lead to a job path. But it occurs to me that you weren't doing something, totally wild, but you were doing journalism and advertising, and you ended up pursuing career paths that were fairly far afield from that. Any reflections on, what you would advise someone today to think about if they're interested in pursuing what you call greenfield jobs, those jobs that don't yet exist today?
Yes, there's a couple things that come to mind. I think one, now is such a great time just to try to pay attention to the things that you like and the things that you don't like. And I know this sounds really basic, but I feel like when I reflect on my college experience, those opportunities were few and far between where someone really asks, do you like this? Or what do you like about this? Or do you not like this? And, so I would encourage people to just try things and experiment. And if you try it and you don't like it, that's not failure. You just learned something really important. You learned something that you don't like. You might even be really good at it, which is harder because then other people are really going to want you to do that. But pay attention, especially if you're good at it and you don't like it, because ultimately that won't sustain you. I fundamentally believe there's a lot of things that you can learn. And one of my favorite quotes, though, is that you can't manufacture passion. So really taking the time and identifying the things that you're passionate about will just go a really long way. And I know that sounds really basic, especially when we're talking a lot about what are these tangible skills that will get you a job after school. But the other thing I think about when I think about some of the skills, and we think about them as soft skills, but some of them I think were the most material throughout my career. And I think also material for entrepreneurship and material for leadership. Those things I think go hand in hand. But how you work with people. And these are skills that will apply to any job, anything. And so I shared this example of the Ford Foundation and the grant, and I have a partner, and so we've got two of us coming to the table. Things are completely greenfield. there's very few boundaries except we've got a deadline and we've got a deliverable. I'm bringing ideas to the table. He's bringing ideas to the table. I, of course, think my ideas are better. And so it's such an important time to, there's so many skills in there that I think of, like, how do I take information and distill it and form a perspective around it? How do I communicate that perspective? How do I listen to other people's perspectives and then decide what to do with that information? Do I take it in? Does it change my perspective? Do I accommodate it? Do I dismiss it? Do I argue with it? Do I debate it? So thinking through that, then, understanding the implications of all of those actions, whether I take it in or whether I debate it or whether I dismiss it entirely. But there's so much in there that applies to enrolling other people in your idea, leading a group of people in a team, whether you formally lead them or whether they are on the ride with you and their peers. These are all, I think, super critical skills that can easily be dismissed as soft skills, but I think those, again, have been probably some of the most material to my overall career.
So for those of you who are on campus, this is a powerful argument for our New Venture Challenge, which is open to anybody who wants to start something new, something greenfield, faculty, staff, student. Appreciate your sharing those thoughts. Before we leave your experiences at CU behind, you mentioned something in our prep call that I thought was a fascinating assignment. You were asked to write your own eulogy while you were here. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, this is one. So one of the things was we spend more time together. I'm pretty transparent, for better or for worse. This includes sharing some of my more embarrassing moments. This was one of them at CU. We received an assignment and we were asked to go home and write our eulogy and come back and present it to the class. And you may be quicker than me and realize that the reason for this was to take time reflecting on your values. What's really important to you when you're at the end of your life? What do you want? What do you want to show for it? What do you want people saying about you? So such a meaningful exercise. Well, some of that was, I think, a little lost on me at the time. First of all, I'm not sure I completely understood what the word eulogy meant, but of course I was not going to ask because that was embarrassing. So essentially, I come back to class and I have event planned my funeral. I have the music picked out. I've decided what the weather's going to be like. So pretty embarrassing as I'm presenting all this to my peers and they're sort of staring at me, being like, that's a nice song. I'm not sure why we're spending so much time on it. Thankfully, I was allowed to go back and redo the assignment. But I also share that because that was such a great moment. I feel like I could have done that exercise 10 times. I essentially do it again. I think it's so important that we're taking that time to continually reflect on what are the things that are most important. Am I spending time on those things? That happens to me multiple times a year where I've said, this is most important to me. And then I'm spending 80% of my time on something else. And I have to be intentional or things get upside down. And so while that was a bit embarrassing, it was a good lesson on the why it's important to really take time and reflect on something like your own eulogy.
I've heard said, show me your calendar and I'll show you what's important, or I'll tell you what's important to you. Do you believe in that?
I do, absolutely. And I'm not always, I would want to show you my calendar right now. what that might look like, at least as it like gets complicated as it relates to work and family and things like that.
Do you remember the song that you wanted at the funeral?
Oh, it was a U2 song. Because I was a big fan of U2. Actually, I can't remember the title of the song right now, though. But it was good, and I walked through every verse of it. So, yes.
All right. So you go from CU. Was it the old Pac Bell? Was that the phone company that you started?
Yes, it was Pac Bell. It was a leadership development program because I actually came out. Funny enough, basically my senior year of advertising, it was time to do my thesis, and I went into my advertising professor and said, I don't think I want to do advertising. I'd also like to graduate on time. Thankfully, he was very supportive in me writing my thesis on something completely different, which was around organizational development and leadership, which led me to Pac Bell. They had a leadership development program, and I really wanted to manage people. And so I had a chance to do that coming out of school.
So I'm going to combine different experiences into one question. If it doesn't fit, answer the question you'd like. Between the experience at Pac Bell, but then especially Alta Vista, one of the early search companies, and then you're early at Yahoo, you mentioned that these jobs taught you, I think the language that you use is how to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Give us an example as to what you mean by that from your experiences early on.
Yeah, I think a big recommendation I'd have is just be fearless in asking questions and fearless in your curiosity. And sometimes, the risk you take is that you might look silly or stupid. And I think it's more than worth it. And what I have found in my career is that more often than not, people really appreciated my honesty and transparency, but more so clearly I was interested and enthusiastic and seeking to understand. But an example of that is when I first joined Alta Vista, it was really early. I was definitely I was the only person who had joined them from the phone company. I had nothing digital in my background. And so I would be almost every meeting, and I'm like, what is a pixel? Like, what is at the time those banner ads, they call them a 468 by 60, which were the pixels. I didn't know that. I had to ask. I'm like, what's a 468 by 60? And I still, again, I think at some point my boss actually dropped off a dictionary of terms on my desk so I could go figure this out. But I just think it's so important to ask those questions and don't feel like you have to know it all to do something. And I think that happens to a lot of people. I mean, actually, as you were talking about the New Venture Challenge, and I promise Brad did not pay me to promote this. It's just as you talk about that really resonated, because I think for many people, they feel like they have to have a certain set of skills, knowledge, or experience to do something. And that is less true than it's ever been. And so I think just that to be fearless, to not be afraid to maybe look a little stupid or silly and ask questions and try to learn it and give it a go, I think is one of the most important things you can do.
So, and are you an expert in quantum computing?
Absolutely not.
Okay, so let's take that for example. Let's say that you were plopped down tomorrow and role as CEO or COO of a quantum computing company. Is there a sort of a methodology that you've developed as to here's how I get up to speed in an emerging area where the future's not yet there? I mean, that's where you were at Alta Vista, right? We didn't know Google was coming. It was early days of search, and you didn't have the background in digital. You presumably knew something about journalism and advertising, and you've been at Pac Bell, but you were having to get up to speed in a new and emerging area. If you were plopped down, say, at a quantum computing company, what does that look like to get comfortable with the discomfort of a new area for you?
I think the first is just scheduling time and having as many conversations as possible. I mean, I would essentially, I don't know that it's terribly scientific, but get time with every single person at that company and understand their experience and what they're doing, and also understand their perspective on quantum computing in this example, and how do they define it, and what do they think the opportunities are and the challenges are, and what are the risks, what are they afraid of. And so I think really taking the time to listen and get those perspectives. It sounds simple. I think sometimes you'll see people coming into those leadership positions and they feel a lot of pressure to deliver, to add value, to say like, okay, I'm here and now I'm going to lead. But in order to do that, you have to not speak and go out and do that work and get that information and try to get up to speed. And then you can start to lead from that place. The other thing I would say, I think it's also really important to note, where do you feel like you can really get to a place, of knowledge where you're additive, et cetera. And where is there essentially a place where that will always be a blind spot? And so do you need to hire for that? How do you account for that blind spot or weakness or whatever you want to call it? Because I think the other thing is important is figure out how you account for that and then find a way to make sure you're also playing to your strengths in those environments.
Deciding which direction to go with that. I would like to talk a little bit about Alta Vista. You mentioned, early days of search ultimately was acquired by Google. Any reflections about, an emerging market, and Alta Vista was one of the first movers in terms of search. Anything that you took away from that experience in terms of when you're part of something that's just emerging, here's what you might want to look for in a company?
Oh, there's a couple things. One, I'm just a big believer in looking for, as you might expect, looking for things that are emerging. And as you're looking for that, looking for things that are on a pretty fast growth trajectory. With growth comes opportunity. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it might not work out, to be honest. But I think there's always learnings and opportunity. And that's been true. Alta Vista, Yahoo, Facebook, is you had people coming in early in their careers, the growth is exploding. They're like, hey, I need you to go set up a sales team. I need you to go figure out the product that we're going to build. I actually need you to onboard and manage the 4 people that were just hired yesterday. And that is, I think you need to be wired that you enjoy that and that's not completely overwhelming. But if you are, then I think the learning and opportunity and trial by fire that comes with that is really incredible. The other thing I would look for in that environment is really people and culture. And so people, first and foremost, I say your manager. I think it has to be broader than that, especially in a fast moving environment, because your manager is probably going to change 8 times. But I think in really understanding the ethos of the company, how do they think about developing and supporting people? That's really important, particularly if you're going to be in a spot where you're taking a lot of risk and you're growing and developing. And then also your peers, the teamwork, like how do people approach things? How do they help one another? Is the culture transparent? Does the culture value risk-taking and failure? There's, I think, just a lot of things that are really important for those environments. And oftentimes it does start with, particularly at smaller companies, but it starts with the leader or the founder or the entrepreneur, because they're often setting the tone that trickles through the company.
One more question before we move to Facebook. So you're in San Francisco from 2000 to 2010, especially Alta Vista, a small startup at the time, Yahoo early on. You're fairly junior in your career at that point. What was it like as a young woman in the tech culture at that point? What were some things that stand out to you? That was there mentorship that was important, and what were some of the challenges?
Yes, it's a great question. It's interesting because it differed by companies and jobs and teams, but I think there's a couple instances where I was often like the only woman on the team. The good news, I think I had good solid experiences in that. At the same time, I think there were things that may have made that hard in terms of I look different than the rest of my peers. Or I used to joke I had a job that I traveled a lot and all of my peers were men, and I was sort of like, okay, there's no one at home doing my dry cleaning. Like they were all joking around about their partners doing their dry cleaning, which that feels a little Mad Men, like 1980s in and of itself, I realize. But it was, and the good news is I had a relationship. I could speak up and say that and call them out on it. And then it was all friendly and fine. Not everybody has that. But And I think, the flip of that is, as you point out, I think there's also people that really supported me along the way, which made a significant difference. And I think of someone, his name is Kurt Hecht. He was in the agency world. And, as a side note, one of the most fit people I know and died of lung cancer a few years ago, which was a big shock and a surprise. But I was kind of a young person on the account for General Motors, and he walked into the president of Yahoo and said, "I want Kelly to manage my business." And there was a whole team, and he wanted me to be the point person for that business. And it's individuals like that that make a really big difference. And that made a big, I don't know if the president of Yahoo knew who I was at that time. And that makes a big difference when people like that stand up. And even like put themselves out there for your own career. I have similar stories of that joining Facebook, a fantastic manager. And he pushed me to, I think, rethink what was possible in my career, started asking me pretty early on, like, have you explored board positions? And when that question first came up, I was like, what do you mean? Like, that's like, I don't look at myself that way. Like, how would I go take on a board position? And I think having those people in my life who helped me like rethink or reframe what was possible for myself and my career made a really significant difference. And that's something that's important to me, like just paying that forward. I think we can all do that either as a manager or as a peer. I have a group of women that I meet with. We all work at different companies and we play this role for one another. Like, what do you want to do? Well, why can't you do that? It's sort of like, what's the dream you don't want to say out loud because it's too scary? Well, say it and let us help you find a path to get there.
Obviously, you were open to working with someone in a way that you were taking guidance and working with somebody to use your words to help reconfigure your career and what was possible. Is there guidance that you would give, say, someone who's junior or relatively junior in the emerging company community here, or maybe a student on campus, as to here's some things that you might do to make yourself open to working with a mentor in a productive kind of way, or to facilitating these types of productive relationships that help you turn you into a leader?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. I think one, just doing some work to identify people that you're either interested in what they're doing, or this can look different depending on what your exposure is to different people, but are they doing a functional role that's of interest to you, or have you been able to sort of see them in action and it's a style that really resonates with you, or someone that you really respect? As you can identify a couple of those things, then I would say don't hesitate to reach out, and then just be somewhat pointed in the ask. I think sometimes it can be a very general, like, I'd like a mentor, and that's probably not quite specific enough. But to say, like, what is it about that person that's interesting? Or, could we do a 30-minute call and I could learn more about X? I think for the most part, hopefully people will find people are really open to doing that and sharing their experiences and being helpful, etc. But I think probably doing a little bit of that homework and then not being shy about the outreach is great. And then maybe being modest in the ask and seeing what develops. Again, I think just meeting someone and then saying, will you be my mentor, could be hard for some, but saying, could we do a 30-minute conversation and I can learn more about what you do is great. And then some of those relationships may grow and expand, others may not, and you just had a great 30-minute conversation. But I think that's really helpful. And then, I think the other would be just listen, learn, be open to advice. At the same time, I think at moments in my career, I also ran into the trap where I put so much weight into somebody else's advice and comments, and I let that drown out my own thoughts and my own voice. And there's a quote that I love that's all advice is autobiographical. So just know that, like, whatever advice somebody's giving you, it's because of whatever their direct experience has been, and that experience may be different from yours. And so take it and learn from it, but also don't, be able to sift through it and take the pieces that, mean something to you, and, it's okay to throw out some of it that doesn't, resonate with you too.
So take us back to 2010. You have a 3-month-old. You at this point have your professional footing. You know your way around the tech scene, having been at Alta Vista and Yahoo. For those on the call, 2010. Facebook was not being mentioned at that point in the same breath, by me at least, as Microsoft or even Google for that matter, or Apple. Why'd you decide to take the job at Facebook? What went into that?
It is a good question. So it was interesting because when I joined, Facebook was about 750 people. I mean, for comparison, I think they're probably at 60,000 now. They were 40,000 when I left. So that was some pretty dramatic growth from 750 to 40,000. But, essentially that big driver, it sort of goes back to those fundamentals I was talking about. Like, I think, I was aware of them from a tech perspective, and sort of seeing some of that growth just sort of out of the corner of my eye. Also, I was really excited about the product at the time. I think this idea of connecting people and creating community was really interesting to me. It was sort of the first product of its. I mean, MySpace was kind of doing that. I wasn't on much of MySpace or Friendster at the time. They were doing some of that, but for me, I think that the innovation of the product was also really exciting. And then the third was I got the call from someone I had worked with previously who was just like, come have coffee. I tried to avoid him for a while because of the timing. And then I was like, okay, I'll come have coffee. And then walking into the building at that time, and you could feel like it sounds cheesy, I suppose, but you could feel the energy, you could feel the buzz of like what was going on, people working on this stuff and just understanding how early they were and figuring out some of these products, etc. I was like, okay, like I mean, I knew I was doomed from like the very first meeting, that I was like, now we have a problem on our hands because I really want to go work there. So now we're gonna have to figure it out.
What was your first job there?
So my first job, I mean, this was another funny thing in terms of paths. So I ended up with 2 different job offers going in, one with product and one with sales, starting a sales team there. And so then I had 2 weeks of trying to figure out which job did I want to take, which is obviously a wonderful problem to have, but I was struggling with which direction I wanted to go. And I ultimately chose the sales route because it was managing, developing, and building a team of people, which has been a theme for me. And so that's the route I went. Of course, as you mentioned in my intro, a few years later, I actually ended up going back into the product route. So that's sort of funny. I still made my way there anyway. But that was, I think that really sort of, pushed me to make that decision.
You mentioned that at Facebook, your relationship, or at least the relationship between your personal life and your professional life, that dynamic was, you didn't use this word, so push back if it's incorrect, but somewhat melded together, or collapsed into one another, that you after joining Facebook, compartmentalized your personal and professional life less than before. Talk a little bit about what it means to bring your whole self to work and how you experience that.
This is, I feel like, one of the many, but one of the gifts that Facebook really gave me. And I laugh when I look back on it, because as I had said to you, I, up until that point, had really tried to keep I had this sort of professional persona, if you will, and then I really kept my personal life private, which I joke, it's not like there was anything super exciting going on in my personal life that I needed to hide. But I don't know if that was being relatively young and female, if I was always trying to put forth a certain persona, I have no idea. But essentially, going to Facebook, this is where Facebook as a product really influenced the culture. It influenced like how you showed up as a person, because basically the ethos of that was bringing your whole self to the product of Facebook and being authentic and true, etc. And then we were encouraged, of course, to use Facebook as a product. I used it for personal use, I also used it as a platform for work purposes. And by the very nature of that, that essentially just brought straight together my work and personal life. So now I'm like posting baby photos and I'm posting photos of the team offsite, and it's all kind of coming together. And it was a really wonderful thing on a few fronts. I mean, one, to be able to show up as your whole self at work and, talk about what your family means to you. And also, at the same time, either talk about or visibly show how hard you're working. It also, I think, is fantastic from a manager and leader perspective to be able to, work with a team of people and really better understand them as whole people. I think makes a really big difference. I think then you're able to really sit down and say, well, what excites you and what motivates you, and how can I support you in shaping a career and a life that brings all of that together. So I'm really grateful for that, and I continue to operate that way. I think it's also an important hallmark of culture of other companies as well.
Another thing about the timing, when you join Facebook, mobile is coming in a very big way. And there's an innovator's dilemma that Facebook had, where the company is doing exceptionally well. It's clearly won in terms of social network 1.0. It's beaten back MySpace, Friendster is done. And there might be one view that, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's keep going in this direction. But that's not the way that Mark Zuckerberg and the company went. Can you talk about the decision to go heavy into mobile, and how did that actually occur within the company?
Yeah, it was it's one of my, I think, pretty salient memories. We did an all hands as a company, and it was the first time when we tried to do a company all hands that we had outgrown the room where we used to do the all hands. So they had to put a tent in the parking lot so we could all go out and be together in the tent in the parking lot for this particular all hands. And so we're in the tent in the parking lot, and at this moment, Mark kind of stands up in front of the room and talks about like what we're seeing in terms of this explosion of mobile. And you would think maybe it would be more of a happy moment. It was more of probably it was a cautionary moment, if that's the right word. But basically, he was standing up saying like, we're late. Like this has happened, and part of us are scratching our heads because we're like, what do you mean? Like the growth is off the charts. This is great. Everything's great. And so it was this moment of like, yes, but desktop growth, like we're going like this, but the actual growth, desktop's really flattening out, and the growth of mobile is skyrocketing. And so it was this like call to action of having to make a really hard pivot to developing for mobile first. So all products now would be developed for the mobile platform first and desktop second. And in that example, he said, when you come to do product reviews with me, like you need to bring the demo and wireframes and everything in mobile. And people would joke because the first week or two, a couple PMs and engineers would show up with the wireframes for desktop, and then the meeting was immediately ended. So that'll probably only needed to happen like once or twice, and then that didn't happen anymore. But it was a really big moment, and I think just an incredible example of Mark's foresight and leadership, because that change, I think was sort of that next growth, next wave of growth for Facebook that was really dramatic.
One more question about Facebook. You left was it late 2017?
Yes.
So during that period, I would say that the cultural zeitgeist about tech companies, including Facebook, the pendulum swung a lot, from wow, what a fabulous thing to connect the world, to disintermediate barriers to allowing people to connect and share information, to concerns about the impact on democracy and other challenges that we've had with social media. How has your personal view of Facebook's impact on the world, has it shifted over the years, or how do you look at it as someone who invested a lot in building the company?
It's a good question and a hard question. I mean, I think this is where if you want to call it drinking the Kool-Aid or whatnot, but I am a firm believer in the initial mission of Facebook to make the world more open and connected. And I, believe that Mark has built this for good, and the people there still there, have built this for good. And so many good things came from that, and things that we had exposure to, things happening around the world that we would not have otherwise had exposure to. I mean, it gave people who otherwise didn't have a voice or a way to organize, it gave them a way to organize, which I think was incredible. There were the stories early on of people finding someone to donate a kidney to them that they had never met, and were willing to step up. And so just really incredible things. And obviously, that, like, what's happened, like where they are now, and in particular, I think it's been, a really tough year for Facebook, potentially the most challenging that they've had. And I think what that's shining a light on is the responsibility that comes with this. And so, and I don't have all the answers, but I think really needing to embrace the responsibility of a platform with this kind of reach. The tricky part here is, sometimes, and I don't mean this as a cop-out, I think Facebook is a mirror for what's happening in broader society. And so I think that's a little bit of like, well, what, where does it start and stop? I also think Facebook is the poster child for this broader problem that is part of the mainstream media, Google, YouTube, TikTok, etc. And so I think there's questions like we have to be asking ourselves more broadly. And that's what, like, if, people react and respond to, we talked about this a little bit, but if people react and respond to these really sensationalized headlines, and then all of these outlets, or news outlets in particular, are encouraged to keep doing that, because then that's what gets them page views, and that's what gets them paid and making money and being, good, productive companies. So I think we need to relook at these business models. I mean, news has been doing that for a while in particular, and I think people are starting to get more comfortable and embrace the idea of paying for content, which I think we've got a lot further to go, but could make a material difference. And I think, well, these platforms need to come together and think through, like, what are the ethics of that? What are the responsibilities that each of those companies have in protecting their users and citizens?
Does that perspective inform your role as an investor? Do you have those conversations with CEOs that you work with now in terms of responsibility and, hey, you might want to think about, if you have success, here's the responsibility that comes with that success? Is there an example that comes to mind?
That's a good question. I mean, I think first what comes to mind is just the first place I go is the integrity of the founder. I mean, it's obviously nearly impossible to forecast there's no way Mark creating this in his dorm room in Harvard would have ever been able to know where he is today. So, I mean, I think from an investor standpoint, that's where you are really spending time, though, on the integrity of the founder, the thoughtfulness of the founder, like how do they really think about, all sides of a problem, the risks, the reward, etc. And so in that respect, that's something that we really think about and connect with founders on.
Well, let's transition talking about the venture fund and the venture work at F7. So this is where we started the conversation, that you and 6 other Facebook colleagues pooled your capital. There's a strong part of the mission to get behind women-led businesses and other underrepresented leaders through your investing. Can you talk a little bit about deal flow? And so when we talk about deal flow in the world of venture capital, it's, how does Kelly find the company that is worth getting behind? Often venture capitalists will tout their proprietary deal flow, that no one else can see this because my social network can surface these best and brightest entrepreneurs, which can be great, but it also has the challenge that it tends to surface people who are already embedded in the network which can work to exclude certain types of founders. How does your deal flow and F7's deal flow work?
So there's a couple things, and I think you really call it out that, it's interesting because in venture, like there's so many things that still feel like, the model is 10 plus years behind. And so even in the concept of deal flow, it's still heavy network-based, relationship-based. And, right now, that's what that points to is the importance of F7 and others like us coming to the table, because what we bring with us are networks that look different. And so if we just even look at the past couple of years, we've had over 500 companies, if we want to come into our funnel, if you will. If you look at the construct of that, I believe it's 68% of those had an underrepresented founder. So that deal flow, just by nature, I think, of who we are and our networks, looks wildly different than a traditional venture firm. And also then points to, we then from there really diligenced 130 companies. We invested in 19 of those, and again, 70% of those are underrepresented founders. But again, I'm sort of underscoring, like, that points to the need of, like, why we need more diverse funders, so we can get more capital to diverse founders. We actually don't have a shortage of diverse founders, but the capital is not, it's not getting to them in a meaningful way. And I think I may have said this up front already, but unfortunately, funding for female founders is actually at a 3-year low. It was already 2.9%, now we're at 2.2%. That number is even lower for other and underrepresented groups. So Black, I think, is at 1.2%, Latinx and LGBTQ plus, or both under 1% of total venture dollars going to those founders. That we have a really long way to go.
The disruption associated with the pandemic, and whether it's the work from home movement, some people leaving the Bay Area for different reasons, including climate change, arguably democratizes the economic geography of starting a business. Now, it's probably an overstatement to say that it is as easy to start a successful business in Phoenix, Arizona, as it is in Silicon Valley. I'm not sure I buy that, but it's easier today than it was 30 years ago. As we see different startup scenes start to emerge and even thrive, how much do you think that will be wind in the sails of getting more investment to female founders as well as underrepresented founders? Does geography play a role in this?
That's a good question. I think what, as you describe, and I think we were already seeing some of these trends around remote work and distributed teams with COVID in 2020. We're seeing all of that explode. And what I like, as to what you allude to, is I do think that really distributes opportunity. And I think hopefully, we'll begin to reshape what some of those networks look like. And there's a few things happening. I think you see funding focused on, let's say, underrepresented individuals. There's also funding in firms that are focused on different geographies in order to, help fuel innovation in those areas. The other thing, I don't know if this is directly answering your question, but as I think about this, is there's just a lot more work to do across the ecosystem. And so I think some of the first more visible changes we're seeing is in this early stage, pre-seed, seed, venture firms like ours with underrepresented funders, supporting underrepresented founders. Now we need that to start to play through. We need more diverse funders from the early stage all the way to growth. So, because what can happen is there's a whole bunch of capital coming in the market saying, I'm happy, diverse founder, to give you your first check. And now they're really struggling to raise their A, their B, their C, their D. And so I think it's really one of the things we think a lot about is what are our relationships in the ecosystem? What is the brand that we're building in the ecosystem so that we're high signal, so that we're helping influence the A round for our funders, or maybe the B round our founders, or maybe the B round for our founders, but we need support all along that ecosystem. And oh, by the way, I haven't even talked about the LPs yet, and the LP standing for limited partner. So those are people who give us money to essentially invest on their behalf and hopefully make them lots of money. And we have
Kelly,
there.
Could I stop you just for a second? And then I'm going to go deeper on that line of thought. But just for those that are coming from outside the world of venture, botanical metaphors play a powerful role in the early stage of a company. So we'll talk about pre-seed and seed companies. This is the investment at the very earliest stages of a startup's life cycle. And then as the startup starts to have traction, and prove success, say product market fit, we start to get into an A round and a B round. We now move from the botanical labels into alphabetical labels. And by the time you get to a G round, it's like, why hasn't this company been sold or gone public? So that's kind of the way that this goes. And Kelly, your point is a really interesting one, which is, okay, a fund like F7 can play an important role as a signal for founders at the pre-seed and the seed stage. Now we need funds that are going to specialize in cutting larger checks for investments at the Series A and B round as the company goes through its growth trajectory. Are you seeing an emergence of funds that are able to say close on $300, $500 million that are going to play from the A rounds through the C rounds, or is there a dearth in that market?
Both. So I would say, yes, there's good movement. There's funds are, the more established funds are, I think, focused on getting more underrepresented individuals as check writers. That's positive news. You're seeing really well-established VCs. I think of like Mary Meeker, who spun out and started her own venture firm, Bond, and with her incredible track record, was able to raise significant capital even for a first fund. So we're seeing good moves, and we need a lot more. I think there's a couple other things we need in that, and one is I mentioned LPs, and so Yale actually came out recently. They have a $31 billion endowment that they put across asset classes, from venture to hedge funds, etc., and is the first endowment to come out and say, I am now going to measure my money managers, so venture firms and others, on their diversity, on their ability to hire and retain women and other underrepresented individuals. This is really powerful. I hope this sets an example for many others. Again, I think Yale is the only one right now, and university endowments and pension plans, and those are big LPs in venture funds. And so we need much more of that. The other thing we need is performance data, because I think there's still a spot where people are like, well, yes, like this is the right thing to do, and this is good for the world. And the venture ecosystem is motivated by returns and money. And so what we need is the data that continues to show this isn't just the right thing to do, this is good business. That data exists. I just think we need more of it. And so, a couple examples of this is diverse founding teams drive a 30% increase on, they call it multiple on invested capital. Essentially, that's the money you get back for the money that you put in. So diverse teams are driving a dramatic increase in performance. They're also showing venture firms with at least one female partner are seeing a 10% better performance overall. So we're seeing some good data, but we need more of that to, I think, get some of these institutions to start to make some more dramatic changes, and then fuel that capital all along the ecosystem, as I mentioned, from seed to G or whatever letter it goes to.
All right, well, as I previewed at the outset, we'll reserve the remaining time for Q&A with those who are attending virtually. Thanks everyone for being with us. If you want to put your questions into the Q&A box, we'll use that. And Daniel, you are on. Daniel, this is part of the Weiser rule, which is named in Silicon Flatiron's founder Phil Weiser's honor. The first question goes to a student. I'll say behind the scenes, Daniel might have been the most thoughtful student we've had in the history of this rule. He's got like 16 questions ready to go. Daniel, pick one. Go for it, man.
Brad, you took all my good ones. What I have is, I guess, sort of on the flip side of the conversation we were just having, have you seen an effect from COVID on the culture of like sort of the entrepreneurial hustle of that's been promoted over the last 15 years been changed? And like, if not, how has COVID affected your companies that you founded, and maybe how have you supported them?
Sure. All good questions. I may not answer it all in the same order, so let me know if I missed it. But there's sort of a couple things that we're seeing with COVID, and we touched on this a bit. I think, one has been interesting. So we've invested in some companies that had all pre-COVID had embraced remote work and distributed teams. A few that we've invested in had already built their entire engineering teams outside of the US. And so a couple of things that happened. I think we already saw some really fantastic results of that. Those companies were able to move really fast. The competition for talent, particularly technical talent in the Bay Area, is really tough, even more so if you're an early stage startup, from having to, if you're trying to get great talent and you can't necessarily pay them what more established companies pay them, you've got to get people that are really willing to take that leap for equity with you. So I think, what COVID has simply accelerated is, I think, companies embracing distributed teams, which I think is, great for talent and great to enable those companies to move fast. I think there's some challenges with that as well. It was interesting because I was talking to a talent partner at a large VC firm last week. He said the other thing they've seen is even C-level executives will join a company, they're joining remotely. Some of them are deciding after a few months that it's not the right fit and they're bouncing out. And that was fascinating to me. I was like, oh, that you've kind of removed, in a way, you've removed a barrier, a hurdle that in that case might have been important to say, oh, this is like this. I'm going to move my family across the United States. This is a big decision. And now you're seeing, or I think what could be happening, people are maybe not able to read the culture or some other things. And then when they get in, they're having some discovery. So I think there's some things like that we're going to need to work through or overcome. But I think to your hustle question, I don't think that's changed. I think we're seeing, companies and founders really hustle, get creative, looking for talent, embracing talent that's outside of the regular sources and networks, which I think is all really positive. Maybe a second part to that, we've seen probably some positives and negatives from COVID within our own portfolio. So again, there's some where COVID has simply accelerated what they were already doing with again, we have companies who've built for remote work. So that's been exploding. Companies that have been some really interesting solutions around mental health, and now telehealth, the adoption of telehealth has exploded. Like, it sort of staggered me that it's sat around 5% for years. COVID changed that. The good news is that opens up a lot of opportunity for innovation and access. So we're seeing some really good news stories there where it's actually fueled growth. We also have some examples where companies are having to pivot. We have one company that was working in travel, and now they're like, well, we could wait. We've got money in the bank and we could wait X number of months and see what happens, or we could take the money that we have and do something different. And they're pivoting to sort of essentially a whole other company and industry. And I'm really impressed. That's a big decision to make, and they're doing it. And we're excited for them. There are others which they, had incredible, these big contracts with Fortune 500 companies, and COVID hit and that all froze. And that's really tough for an early stage startup. So we're seeing kind of implications of that across the board. And then the last thing I would say, just with the COVID impact, as we were just talking about funding, and one that concerns me is, even with these, one of the thoughts is with, as I mentioned, venture funding going to female founders, going from 2.9% to 2.2%. One hypothesis is that in sort of this time of COVID, that investors are getting a little bit more nervous, a little more risk averse. They're going back to either their networks, or this word I hate called pattern matching, that they're kind of going back to like, oh, well, no, let's go back to what I really think a founder and entrepreneur looks like, and I'm going to invest in that. I hope that's not the case. I hope that doesn't hold. I think the good news is tech overall has been pretty resilient, and so I think we're seeing things start to move again, or move faster.
I'm going to ask Vanessa on our team. Can we promote individuals from the Q&A to ask the question, or should I read them? Vanessa?
We can go either way.
Okay, if we can promote Lori, let's bring her in.
Lori, what was her last name?
Lori Bergen, B-E-R-G.
Oh, yes, gotcha.
Lori, we may have mortified you by promoting you, but if you ask your question, go ahead. And if not, I'll take it.
I see her cute cat.
All right, well, I'll ask it. She said, people who succeed spectacularly have usually had epic fails. What was your biggest fail, and how has it changed you? How has it affected your approach to mentoring and supporting others to succeed?
Oh, good question. I mean, I feel I've had many fails. Maybe this is a defense mechanism. I do tend to think of them as learning opportunities, not like failures, totally. But let me, I'm trying to think of a few. I think one that comes up, they're probably along the same vein, so I'll share it as an extension. One is sort of funny because I was when I was making the move from the phone company, wanting to get into the internet. I don't know how old I am at this stage, 22, 23. I was so worried about taking a step backwards. Like, I was so concerned about either what my job title would be or my level. And I'd worked a hot minute in the professional world. And so that feels so funny to me. I mean, to be honest, I turned down Google twice, basically for this reason, because I felt like the job was either a lateral move or a downgrade. And this was early on. And so that feels really funny that I got so focused on that job or level, and where my focus really should have been was like the company and the opportunity. And it should have been more about like, I don't really care what you want me to do. I'm going to walk through that door and learn great things and do great things, improve myself, and it will all work out. And of course, it's a fine line. We should advocate for ourselves and negotiate and all of those important things. But I think there's also a moment when you see some really big opportunities, you grab it and go. And I did it similarly. I can't now I can't blame myself for being like so young. I did it again, probably, 5-6 years ago, like an incredible startup. I remember going in being like, I'm just not sure what job I would do. Like, I can't figure out like what you need or what the job is. And if I look back again, I feel like I should have been like, this is awesome. What do you need? And if you'll take the bet on me, I'll come do that. And so that's, I think thematically, that's kind of what comes up for me. And again, how I try to approach things now is like just looking for the opportunity, and it doesn't need to be perfect, and just sort of jump in and go for it.
Kelly, our next question comes from Grace, who I'll embarrass her a little bit. She's been closely involved in an angel investing fund that we have on campus called the Deming Center Venture Fund.
Fantastic.
In terms of next generation of investors coming off the campus, Grace is definitely a candidate. Grace?
Awesome.
Kelly, thanks for coming in. So I had a different question, but I'm going to change it because you talked a little bit about Facebook and, how it had this kind of, altruistic vision of like connecting people and folks. And so I'm wondering, do you have a response to like, with the proliferation of fake news and like unsubstantiated sources and Facebook kind of being an echo chamber for different sides of the aisle, like what, is it too late to actually address these issues? And how can Facebook actually work with other businesses to actually combat maybe some of the more nefarious uses of tech with with deep fakes and AI or algorithms and things like that?
Yeah, I definitely don't think it's too late. yeah, no, say it's not too late. Like, I think, and then I love what you said in there, because I think this solution will be coming together with others. Like, I don't think it's any one entity. Even if Facebook tries to solve it on its own platform, like that's not enough. And so this is the diplomacy, I guess, in that. But I think like this is where either the big FANG companies, et cetera, need to come together and say, like, how do we partner? How do we bring some of our best minds together? How do we open source and share some of this technology that's working and effective? So that's my hope, is that we see more of that, because I think there's been, unfortunately, a little bit more of like finger pointing. So like, don't look at me, look at them. They're worse than I am. And you see that across Apple, Google, Facebook, and others. And that's like, that's not productive. Like, let's actually get those great minds together and figure out how we start solving the problem more effectively.
Kelly, can I interject a quick question? I don't want to take up too much time on this, but there's a different issue from a regulatory perspective, which is the antitrust scrutiny of acquisitions by the big tech companies, including Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, et cetera. From your vantage point as an investor, how worried are people in the startup world that antitrust scrutiny is going to chill acquisitions and that the exit events for many of the companies are going to shrink in the coming years?
There's a couple of thoughts I have on that. I think we might see more acquisition early. And so that you then see companies, that's a higher risk bet, but that they would try to go get a company that's smaller or earlier. So that's sort of one thought for me that takes place. But I think generally I don't feel like there's huge, and maybe that's wrong, I don't feel like there's huge fear in that yet, or that's changing any activity. And I obviously, that M&A and activity is an important part of the overall ecosystem. And I think, knowing those potential exits continue to spur innovation. So I think that's actually really important. I get more alarmed when you hear, stories about companies that entertained an acquisition and then went out and built the feature themselves or built the copycat. Now that's behavior I have like a massive challenge with. I'm like, go acquire the company and invest in the ecosystem and keep it going. But obviously we'll see what happens with that.
Our next question comes from a professor on campus who's been teaching entrepreneurship classes here and really making an impact on our students. George Teresa.
Well, thank you. And thanks, Brad, for including me here. This is really exciting. And Kelly, I would love to know, based on your investing history, are you investing in syndicates with other investors? And if you could share kind of their profiles and help us understand who you invest with, that would be awesome. And also, how often are you guys the lead investor in these deals?
Yeah, great question. So the past couple of years has been our own, we've been kind of a pooled investment vehicle. So it's been our own capital, pretty modest checks. And so we invest alongside a number of different groups, all the way from traditional venture firms to other groups that probably angel investors and other groups that look like us. And I think we've forged particularly strong relationships with others that are also focused on underrepresented founders, and where we see a lot of introductions and deal flow and things like that. But something that's really important to us is one of the things when I was making the move from an operator role, particularly because I cared a lot about managing and developing teams and moving into venture, everyone would say to me, venture is not a team sport. And I think the way we do venture, it is a team sport. And I've also met a number of other investors who approach it as a team sport, which I think is fantastic. And so I think a big part of this is that we, support those, other co-investors, that we bring people in that, we think could be additive or meaningful to the founder in any way. That's one of the reasons we're typically brought in, is because of our operating background, and people think that we can be additive and helpful to founders. And so hopefully that answers your first question. I think to your other, we've had sort of one strategy for the past couple years with our own capital, pretty modest checks. We're actually moving to bring on outside capital, and those will be larger checks, but still a model where we'll look to co-lead a number of deals. So still not an idea where we're trying to elbow everyone out from around the table, but where we can still get meaningful ownership in the deal, but still have meaningful co-investors as well.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Shana Kleiger. Shana.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I really admire you so much and all the work you're doing. And my question's pretty simple, but I'll dive right into it. So you mentioned being involved in various leadership development programs throughout college. And how do you think that these experiences have impacted your career and developed you into the leader that you are today? And additionally, what advice do you have for students who also want to develop their leadership skills?
Thank you for asking that question. I think the leadership pieces and work that I was able to do in college had the most meaningful impact on my career. And some of it sounds probably some of the most simple, but I do feel like college was such an important time of figuring out, I'm coming back to like, what do I care about? What do I value? What's important to me? And then also, how does that translate from how do I work with other people? How do I in the future lead and manage people? That's like the fundamental foundational work. And even when I interviewed, so it was this leadership development program for Pac-Bell, and it's funny to think back on some of the questions. I'm really impressed with them. The interview was geared towards someone coming out of school. They didn't expect me to produce a giant resume of professional things, but there were examples around like, when have you encountered a difficult situation with a friend or someone, and like, how did you navigate it? And I think they were really attuned to paying attention to how do you navigate difficult situations? How do you disagree with someone? How do you effectively work with someone on a project or for a problem? And so I just think like that work is really critical. I think also when I think seeking out those programs and opportunities on campus are fantastic. I think there's also a lot of great books. Last time I was on campus, I walked by someone, she was standing on the corner reading the book Crucial Conversations. And I would have taken a photo of her if that wouldn't have been weird and creepy. But it was so perfect. Like, those are the kinds, Facebook had everybody reading Crucial Conversations, or things like StrengthsFinder. I think having conversations and identifying like, what are the things that are really unique to me that it can be easy to take for granted, but they are really unique to you, and you can build on that, and how you show up as a professional and a leader.
Kelly, and a +1, one of my colleagues at Silicon Flatirons, Heather Martin, just chimed in, best book, exclamation point. You and Heather could have the Crucial Conversations together. Matt Seligman, are you up?
Yes, sir, I am.
Matt, fire away. So Kelly, Matt is coming to us from the law school where he works as a student attorney helping startups in our entrepreneurial law clinic. So he helps get startups organized from a legal perspective.
Perfect.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Thanks, Kelly, for doing this. It's been really interesting. You've had a seat at some very interesting tables. I was curious, given your insider experience with these large, FANG, literal Facebook, I know a lot of them are spinning up their own institutional venture funds. I know Google has one. I'm not sure if Facebook's is operational yet, but I know it's on the table. How do you think that's going to impact, kind of this flow of capital issue? And, are these funds going to be able to leverage the kind of expertise that they may have in their own world to, help these younger companies get off the ground a little more quickly?
Good questions. I think on one piece I'm really excited about is that, I think what we're seeing from corporate venture funds is that they're willing to take more risk early, which I think is fantastic. So you'll see more corporate VCs, for example, invest in first-time fund managers. So that's a nice marriage, as we see probably more new funds than we've ever had, to also see more corporate venture arms to hopefully help fund those funds will be really helpful. And I think they're obviously getting really buttoned up. I mean, I think where I've seen this work well is when they invest in funds or companies, and then they're able to just make their knowledge and networks more accessible. I mean, it's something that I think in the Facebook example, I think they've done that well from their development programs, developer programs, et cetera. They've done that well, and they have the DNA. But again, I think it's really powerful when they can find those ways to open up their networks, to open up the knowledge, and really make that accessible for founders. I think where where it's going to be tricky for all of them is like, what's the signaling risk? Do they follow on? Do they just invest in the first? Because what if Facebook invests, but then they don't follow on, and then people thought that would be a perfect Facebook acquisition, and then what does that do to the company? I think all of that still remains to be seen, but I also trust like they can work that out. And then, to be fair, that happens all the time, and other new funders come in and things work out, but some of that still has to be worked out.
Kelly, I think we have time for one more question. Taylor, you're on.
Hi, thanks again, Kelly. Hi. So when I think of entrepreneurship, I think high risk, and I've kind of been avoiding startups because I want a lot of stability in my next career. So should I be worried? Or is there a bit more stability than I think there is? Does it depend? What should I look for?
Good questions. Well, first of all, I would say know thyself. So I think, it's really important that you are really tuning into like, what is it that I want and what's important to me? And I have, a colleague that I worked with, and she spent years in consulting, and I love that she could articulate this. She was like, I really liked consulting, that I did this for a year or two, and then I did this, and then I did this. And she's like, there was a really clear path for me that was motivating. And I enjoyed that. And I think she then shared an example. She stepped into a really early stage startup, and she didn't enjoy the ambiguity of that. It was really overwhelming. She's like, I work better with more clear constraints. So first of all, I think pay attention to how you're feeling about some of these things. I think the other would say it also doesn't hurt to try and see, like, if you try and you don't like it, it's not the end of the world. Like, then there are other opportunities. But I think maybe when we talk about job stability, it looks different now than it did 20 years ago. I think the average tenure at a job now is 18 months. Obviously, at least when I joined the phone company, people were there their entire lives. And my manager had been there since she was 18 years old, and she retired there. So kind of that respect, the world of work looks very different. And so it also may be reframing what stability looks like, and is it actually a series of experiences that build on one another, and that may or may not be within the same company. But you might find that there's a lot of stability in a functional role in sales or in product or in operations, and you really like those things, and that you build a track record in that, and you build it across multiple companies, and that's where you find your stability. So it might look different, but just keep paying attention to like your reaction to things and how you feel about it, and then also like what stability really means to you, and what that needs to look like for you.
Kelly, I'm going to close with a final question that takes you back to the eulogy exercise.
Oh no!
And in particular, would you two still be the song in terms of the music at the funeral? And more importantly, how does what you'd like your life to reflect look different at this stage in your career than what you thought when you were 21, 22 doing that exercise?
Oh, you left a light one for the end. So there are two songs that came to mind, and literally going like whatever pops in here, which was Whatever It Takes by Imagine Dragons and Good as Hell by Lizzo. So those were the two songs when you asked the question. That's what came up for me. I'm not sure what that means. And then as you asked the eulogy question and what's important, I think that just this concept of legacy comes to mind. I mean, I have a lot of people asking, myself and my colleagues, people have like sort of saying like, you've had the Facebook run, you've been successful in your careers, like, why are you doing this? And at the end of the day, it comes back to legacy. And I fundamentally believe like we're in a position to help fuel change. And that's incredibly motivating for me. And really important as I think about like what I want to leave the world and the planet when I leave, the learnings, the teachings that I want to give to my kids. I want them to see that I'm like willing and able to do this at whatever step or chapter this is in my career. And I'll leave with, it's actually a woman that's working with us. She's an investor with us, and as a woman we work together at Facebook, and she's African American and has 2 sons. And one of the founders that we've invested in, the founders, they were on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine about a month ago, and he's Black and did this incredible post on like why he has like wears his dreads in Silicon Valley and the image that he wants to put forth for the Black and African American founder. And she said, we had shared that, and then she had shared that with her sons, and she just talked about like that we have no idea what that means, to be able to support these founders, for them to be able to be that example, and again for her and for her boys, and those are like that kind of story. Was just a reminder of what we're doing and why we want to do this, and the difference that we can make.
Kelly, this has been such a treat. I want to give a thanks again to CMCI and Nathan for being a great partner in making this happen, our Silicon Flatirons team, and to all of the attendees, including those that asked questions. I'm going to encourage everyone to jump over into the Air Meets, which is an interesting virtual way to meet some folks and have discussions after the event. But with that, Kelly, many thank yous for sharing your journey. This has been such a delight. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.